Thanks so much for joining the Santa Fe Watershed Association as we explore the important relationships between soil and water within the context of the Santa Fe River watershed.
My name is Aaron Kaufman.
I'm Maury Hensley. Today, we are at Leonora Curtin Wetland Preserve with Aaron to learn about wetland soil, the water budget, and geology through the lens of the 5 healthy soil principles. This is a great example of some of the healthiest soil remaining in our watershed. Whether your local soil lies within the boundaries of the Santa Fe River watershed or a different watershed, we hope that some of the concepts and histories we'll be discussing throughout the series will provide you with useful information and inspiration for your own explorations of soil and watershed stewardship.
So in previous videos we talked a little bit about the influence of texture on infiltration. Texture, if you remember, is basically a measure of kind of the size of the particles in the soil. So the finest textures would be things like clay, then moving up to kind of larger textures such as silt and then sands, and then you can kind of get more into rock fragments such as gravel, cobble, and boulders. That texture will influence how quickly the water can move through the surface of the soil in terms of infiltration, but it will also begin to influence how well the soil actually holds water, makes it available for plants and plant roots. So if you wanted to actually kind of look at or identify a soil texture, what you could do is you could hold a small kind of amount of soil in the palm of your hand. You can add a tiny bit of water, start to work that soil around a little bit to make sure that it's totally wet, and then you can kind of follow some of the steps that we linked to, but essentially you can do a field test is basically what it is, and you can start to identify the amounts of sand based on the grittiness that you can feel between your fingers, and then the amounts of kind of clays and silts depending on how well that soil holds together in a ball or increases into the length of a ribbon and things like that. When hydrologists are trying to define where water is located in a watershed, oftentimes what they'll do is kind of look at the water budget equation. And all it is an attempt to kind of show the inputs and the outputs from an ecosystem. And whatever's left over is sometimes referred to as change in storage. So the inputs would be things like precipitation, various types of snow or rain, hail. Those are basically the water that's coming into that landscape. And then the outputs would vary. Some of it would be through evapotranspiration. Basically, some water would be evaporated out of the soils from solar energy and wind. Some of it would actually be transpired by plants. So as it's taken up from their roots and passed through their stomata, it kind of re-enters the atmosphere that way. Those are oftentimes lumped together, evapotranspiration, because they're so hard to kind of distinguish apart from one another. Another variable in terms of an output would be interception. Interception is the idea that some of that precipitation or that rainfall might land in the canopy of a tree, never actually make it to the soil to become part of that watershed. So if you were to look at some of the cottonwoods behind me, water that falls into that canopy might land on those leaves and then subsequently evaporate away. So it's kind of lost from the system as well. Another major component in certain ecosystems and watersheds would be runoff. So the water that ultimately makes it to the soils and runs off of the landscape or emerges from aquifers or groundwater kind of springs into rivers and streams, that would be runoff. Or just in situations where maybe you have a degraded landscape and that water is kind of running off of paved areas or down through arroyos, that would be another loss or an output. Ultimately, as you subtract those outputs from your primary inputs, you end up with something that's left over and is kind of constantly in flux. And that could be the water that's, for example, stored in our bodies. We're made up of a large percentage of water, and that water is kind of constantly fluctuating within our bodies. But the primary source or location where you have a change in storage is actually in soils, and that can include water that's percolating through deeper soil layers and ultimately recharging aquifers and then re-emerging somewhere else. It could be soil moisture that's stored in the upper profile and is kind of lost through transpiration by plants, but it's located or stored in that soil for a period of time before those plants use it. That is the primary kind of place where we have a change in storage or a fluctuation of water, and that's located in soils. One of the ways to appreciate how a texture of a soil actually retains or holds water is to imagine a potted plant. So for example, if you have this pot with a little bit of growing media in it, some sort of soil, depending on the texture, that soil will hold water better than other textures. The way to kind of assess or describe that water holding capacity is through three kind of major terms. One is saturation, field capacity is the second, and then the third would be permanent wilting point. So to imagine saturation, essentially what you would do is if you had this potted plant and you began to irrigate that plant to the point where water starts to exit the bottom of the pot, you can see the water kind of exiting the bottom. Essentially what we've done is we've saturated the soil to the point where the water is displacing the air between the soil particles or the textures, and moving under gravity down through the soil profile and exiting the bottom of the pot. Basically, the soil has become saturated. After the soil begins to drain and there's no more kind of water released out of the bottom of the pot, we've reached what's called field capacity. Field capacity is the maximum amount of water that a soil texture will hold against gravity. In the case of sands, you would imagine that more porous texture. Sands would not hold water as well. They would drain more easily, whereas clays, being finer in texture, would actually retain more water. So essentially they would have kind of a higher percentage of that soil volume would be water. As the plant starts to extract that water, the water is depleted in the soil to the point where the plant may begin to suffer and can't extract anymore. It starts to die from kind of drought or dehydration. That's the point at which we call permanent wilting point. It's not to say that the soil is devoid of water, it just means that there's a point at which the soil holds water better than the roots can actually extract it. The reason that these concepts are important is because if you were to imagine the surrounding landscape in the Santa Fe watershed, most of the plants are dryland species. The soils are generally only holding water to a point where more drought-tolerant plants can survive. But the unique thing about this particular site is that the soils are probably maintaining soil moisture at field capacity on a regular basis, or close to field capacity, or at times actually saturated, which allows for kind of this unique type of plant species to exist here. So we have a better understanding of how texture influences water holding capacity, but what would actually cause there to be more water held in the soils at this location versus kind of the surrounding landscape? So if you were to look at the hill slope behind me, you can see quite a few juniper and dryland species plants. And then down in the valley here, you can see species that are much more representative of wetland species, such as the willows and cattails and rushes. There are different variables that might influence the presence of wetlands. In some cases, you might just have sufficient precipitation to allow those species of plants to actually grow at a site. But if you were to look at this particular area, you can imagine that we get the same amount of rain and snow falling at the bottom of this valley right here as you do on the hill slopes behind me. So this is not a situation where precipitation is influencing these particular wetlands. You might have other situations where there's a topographic influence. So if you can imagine the hill slope behind me, you have these different features such as the top of it, which you would refer to as the summit, and then where it becomes a little more convex, you have the shoulder, and then the steepest section referred to as the back slope. Basically, when precipitation falls on this feature, a lot of it would start to run off of it, and ultimately that water or excess moisture would be accumulating down at the foot slope or the toe slope. And so in some cases you end up with wetlands at the base of hill slopes. Out in this particular location, these hill slopes are far too small to probably be contributing sufficient runoff to create these wetlands. So there's got to be some other variable or factor at play. The wetlands here aren't being driven by differences in precipitation. They're not necessarily being driven by runoff from hill slopes or topographical influences. There are certainly biological components that could contribute to wetlands. So for example, beaver in a river system would begin to plug that river and spread that water out to the point where you get more surface flow and less kind of defined channel. And by spreading that water out into the banks and saturating those areas, you can certainly increase wetlands habitat that way. In this particular location, that's still not the case. So the factor that's actually contributing to wetlands at this location is related to the geology. A few miles behind me, there are a number of small volcanic vents, which kind of are indicative of kind of the salt history here, where you would have had lava flows spreading out across this area and created kind of a more impermeable layer of geology, which some of our more permeable soils have ended up kind of building up above. We're kind of looking upslope or back towards the El Dorado area, where there is this buried valley and a lot of water that's kind of infiltrating through the soil surface throughout that community, makes its way down to the aquifer, and ultimately starts to emerge here at Leonora Curtin. Essentially, the water that's draining from that location down to this point, at some point is hitting that impermeable basalt layer or other kind of bedrock components, and is actually lifting that water up into the soil profile to the point where it actually reaches the surface, and it's providing sufficient moisture for these plants, these wetland species, to colonize the area. There are a few things to note in terms of the value of this particular site. One is there's immense water storage here. It's estimated that the soils in these wetlands throughout kind of the La Cienega area between 2000 and 2005 may have held somewhere in the range of 67,000 acre feet of water. That surpasses what we typically store in Cochiti Reservoir. So just in terms of the water resource value, these wetlands are storing immense amounts of water during periods of drought, which can slowly release into the Santa Fe River and other ecosystems or river systems, and essentially kind of maintain those water resources during periods of dry conditions. The other thing is that during storm events, kind of high intensity like rainstorm events, water that might be coming down this valley will hit this wetland system, and it's forced to spread out. You can kind of see the broader kind of elements of the valley here, and as water moves through here, it has to meander between every single piece of vegetation, which slows it down and forces that water to infiltrate into the soil. So this site is actually mitigating the impacts of flooding for people downstream. So any kind of excess water that's coming through here will be slowed down, infiltrate into the soil, and recharge the aquifer through this area, and again makes it more resilient to periods of drought downstream. We've talked a little bit about soil moisture, and soils that are kind of exposed to longer periods of water are sometimes referred to as hydric soils. And you can actually measure the amount of soil moisture in those particular soils or others with a soil moisture probe. And basically this works underneath the principle of conductivity, the idea being that water conducts electricity. And so if you have soils with greater amounts of soil moisture, they would conduct electricity better, and they would give you a higher reading of soil moisture. You can also look at the landscape, and the plants themselves will give you a clue as to how much water is being held in that particular soil. So if you were to look at these particular plants here, these are cattails, and these plants are capable of growing in saturated conditions where in some cases some of the actual air between the soil particles or in that soil texture has actually been displaced, and they're growing under practically anaerobic conditions. If you were to look at the plants like the coyote willow behind me, they don't want to be in conditions that are perpetually wet or saturated. They want a little bit of airspace around their roots. So that would give you an indication that maybe the textures are a little more coarse and there's a little bit more airspace in the soils there, maybe a little less hydrated than this particular area with the cattails. If you were to look a little bit further beyond us, you would actually see cottonwoods, which certainly want access to water, but they are going to be even less tolerant of permanent water conditions compared to these previous two species. And then certainly if you were to look at the surrounding landscape and see junipers or other dryland species, it's a good indication that the soils are substantially drier than this particular location. So to kind of give you an appreciation of the soils in this particular wetland, there's a number of things to kind of note. One is it has really great cover. All of kind of both the living and the dead plants are providing kind of a protective layer. We've talked about that as one of the 5 healthy soil principles, that cover the soil, which kind of reduces raindrop impact and kind of prevents soils from sealing and things like that, from evaporation and things like that, kind of maintains that moisture. So we pulled back some of the organic matter here, and we just dug a small little hole in this particular spot. And a few things to note is, one, this brownish color is really indicative of the rich organic material that's in here. So in previous videos we've talked a little bit about soil profiles. This particular site would have multiple inches of an A layer, basically broken down or decomposed organic material, which starts to form part of the soil horizon. That A layer and that organic material provides a lot of good soil structure, which we've mentioned in other videos. So essentially you can see how this soil is holding together in little clumps. That's really kind of provided by that organic material. And then the other thing to note is just the richness of roots. So this is just one small portion of probably a Baltic rush, a plant which grows in high density through these wetlands, and rich kind of long roots, which if we were to kind of look throughout this area, would be intertwined in such a way that they would hold that soil in place against erosive forces. So essentially these wetland species are providing a lot of soil stability. And then the other thing that you notice is it's incredibly moist, really holding a lot of soil moisture, despite the fact that rainfall might be kind of intermittent, or in some cases they're under drought conditions. One of the other 5 healthy soil principles is to maximize biodiversity, and in wetland systems we're doing a great job of that. Not only does the enhanced soil moisture lead to a really rich diversity of plants above ground, but we actually end up with really good root structure and maintaining living roots in the subsoil, which increases biodiversity. So you have those roots which create immense surface area for microorganisms to adhere to. And in a number of cases, some of those bacteria and other organisms have been shown to break down certain pollutants. By having this richness of diversity of both plant roots and microorganisms in the soil, we're actually in some cases remediating pollutants which might be originating from other parts of the watershed. There are concerns in terms of losing the availability of this water through here, and largely that is kind of driven by lots of wells in the region which are actually pumping groundwater in the community of El Dorado and throughout La Cienega and in Santa Fe, to the point where the water table is dropping and it's no longer kind of reaching the surface of certain wetland systems. The concern is that if we were to deplete water to the point where these wetlands began to dry out, we're losing that spongy value of the wetland, and we'll begin to start to lose some of the vegetation above ground as well, start to move kind of towards drier plant species, which means we lose the rich biodiversity that comes with these plants, such as various types of pollinators, waterfowl, and other species.
To wrap up, here are some key takeaways from this video. Many factors come together to create wetlands and provide important ecosystem services. In addition to being hotspots of biodiversity in our watershed, wetlands store huge amounts of water, process pollutants, mitigate the effects of stormwater and erosion, and even buffer microclimate extremes. At this beautiful wetland, it's easy to see how the 5 and even 6 healthy soil principles can guide our management of other landscapes in ways that can maximize soil hydration, even in arid climates. Hydrated wetland soils are able to support perennial plants with living roots that keep the soil surface covered all year long, which helps to slow, spread, and sink water as it flows over and through the landscape. This reduces evaporation directly from the soil, minimizes erosion, and keeps the temperature cooler. Such a density of roots fosters important relationships with soil microbes, which in turn helps maximize overall biodiversity. Wetlands are therefore also great places to promote the ecological services of animals, particularly wildlife, such as pollinators. Wetlands are especially sensitive to domestic livestock, though, so if you're thinking about the relationship your livestock have to wetland areas, we recommend contacting an expert in regenerative grazing and wetland or riparian ecology to help you with your specific situation. The soils at Leonora Curtin Wetland Preserve remain healthy because there has been much less disturbance in the form of overgrazing, plowing, pesticide and fertilizer application, draining, and development compared with other areas within the watershed. The disturbance this wetland is most vulnerable to is drying, caused by subterranean changes in the aquifer from too many wells. We must steward our water resources sustainably in order to minimize this kind of disturbance. It's vital we do everything we can to protect our watershed's wetlands, especially as our climate becomes hotter and drier in the coming decades. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the rest of our series. See you around the watershed.